Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about how to teach a concept. Now, obviously, there are as many teaching styles as there are teachers. This is just something that I highly recommend. It's something that I use that I think helps a wide array of different types of learners, but obviously take things that work for you and discard things that don't. But let's go straight into it. This is going to be true for not just martial arts concepts, but also many other things in life. But obviously, because this is a martial arts channel, let's kind of gear it towards a martial arts aspect, but understand that this can be used for a wider array. So as an example, I'm just going to be using the idea of using muscle activation, kind of feeling which muscles you're activating as the concept that I'm going to be trying to teach in this video. But I'm going to break it down into how I would like to probably present this material to someone who is new or someone that might be a new-ish concept too. The first thing I'd like for you to consider is to break that concept down into confirmable steps. Now, obviously you can break things down to like an infinitely small pieces, but sometimes it's hard to kind of feel like you're getting any traction if you don't give them like, oh, I can see I am either doing this or not doing this. So make sure like you break down a concept into again, you can verify that you're doing something at each individual step. Now, I'm going to eventually bring this back to muscle activation, but kind of give you a little more of a concrete example. It's like, okay, like let's talk about like a front kick, for example. Like, okay, first, all I want you to do is like knee yourself, try to knee yourself in the chest. Oh, I can maybe knee myself, like, okay, like hold out your palm here, like almost if you're in your guard, see if you can kind of hit your palm here. It's like, okay, I can confirm that, or I'm kind of like, oh, I'm really off angle here. But I can confirm if I'm facing you, if I have my hand down by my solar plexus, I can either hit it or I don't, right? So it kind of gives you, again, this is usually good for younger children, but it's like, okay, I know if I'm doing it or not, but let's use that muscle activation as an example. So the way I like to teach muscle activation is usually in our qianse, our walking stance, right? And again, I have a whole video on like why my distance is what it is. But the first thing I like to do is like once I kind of teach your distance, right? So a very quick way to remember is again lean slightly forward, kind of catch yourself, and kind of naturally in your good distance. But from here, all I generally do is like, okay, first just walk down, right? So just kind of push forward, kind of just see what you naturally do. Okay, you can back up now. Like, okay, just kind of seeing what I'm doing. And it's like, okay, from here, really feel like you're pushing off with your back glute, and just from here try to get just like there, right? There's a speck on the ground, for example. And it's like, all right, just like try to put your foot there without like double stepping. Okay, now try it again, etc., etc. It's like, okay, as you're drawing back, activate that back glute and try to see if you can push your front foot like all the way to this back line. You didn't get that far yet, try it again. And kind of like have those confirmable steps along the way so they can kind of see like, okay, I should be able to generate a lot of power with my motion. I shouldn't be like here, right? So that's one way you can, again, break down a concept into confirmable pieces. So something that would not be as helpful would be like, okay, from here, activate your glute. Is this working? Am I doing it? It's really hard to tell, right? Versus like, okay, like, well, I want you to think about really propelling yourself forward, try to hit that piece, but again, almost like feel your lower back. Now, if you feel like right now, it's not really that, activated, so it's kind of like a little bit floppy, versus like, okay, if I have it back here, and really try to push forward, like, oh, do you feel like your back glute tighten before you pushed? Like, oh, I did feel it, or like, no, I didn't feel like, oh, well, let's keep trying until we do that, or you can get another step, kind of like an intermediary step to get to that point. So this might sound kind of obvious, but break your concept down into, again, confirmable steps. Another thing that can help is to bring in past experience. So even in our walking stance example, right? It's like, okay, like, well, show me how you walk naturally. And they're going like, okay, I'm walking. Like, okay, now just walk backwards. I know you don't do this usually. Okay, we're just walking backwards. Like, okay, well now try to think like, put your hands here and walk. Okay, feels a little bit weirder going backwards. Okay, from here, think about like, okay, how you normally walk, but now like be hyper aware of like the tightening of your glutes. All right, this feels weird, and you can kind of progress from there as well. So versus like, oh, if I was, for example, if I was teaching Chianse for the very first time, if I just said, oh, just do this, like, okay, is it right? Versus like, okay, like show me like how you naturally walk. Like, okay, like, well, walk, stop. All right, like look at your distance. Like, oh, I guess my natural distance is here. Okay, let's try to push it further or narrow it back in depending on, again, your own fighting style or something that you're pushing for. Again, bring in past experience. That's going to be a lot easier for you to teach a concept if you can draw something in from there, as opposed to like theoretically proving something geometrically, which never really persuades that many people. So keep that in mind. So another thing that I would like for you to consider is make sure you explain why you're doing something. So very few things are as frustrating as, oh, just do this. Like, okay, oh, just do this. Do this. It's like, okay, like I can do that, but I don't understand why, therefore I don't have context. I don't understand what I'm doing like about, you know? Versus like, okay, well this is your fighting stance, right? This is your fighting stance, so you want to be able to move pretty effectively in any direction. Now if you're leaning forward, notice that your front glute is activated, your back glute's not activated, and it's really good for me maybe to move backwards, but if I want to move forward, I have to be like, right? Which is not going to be as effective. Like, okay, like so in this case, again, drawing back on, again, the application perspective, is like, okay, like show me your guard, and if they do lean forward, let's just take a side view, and like, okay, move back. Aha, I am a master at this. Move forward. It's like, okay, do you notice that you're kind of like jerking as you try to push forward? Like, oh, well from here, now instead of, so this is probably where I would make an assumption, I feel like you're using too much of your front foot, try to have it equal 50-50. Again, why do you want 50-50? To be able to move around really in any direction. If I am 50-50, I can move to the side, other side, top corner, back corner, forward, back, right? As opposed to if I'm leaning forward, it's harder for me to move certain ways than others. So always make sure you have a reason for things, especially with forms as well, right? So as you're learning a form, maybe the first day you're learning it, it's like, oh, let me just copy what's going on. But after a while, that's going to frustrate the person if they don't understand why they're doing it, or if they're the type of person who don't understand, or they don't really learn the form without understanding it, teach what it's doing, right? It's like, okay, well, form 1, for example, I am getting my distance. This is not necessarily me cutting anyone in half, although you're trying to. So get your distance, then you're going to draw back into your guard. From here, now we're going to be attacking this person. Now the first level of it is to strike, dispatch, strike, dispatch, strike. Now that's really, really simplistic, so let's make that a little more exciting. You cut, they give you an 11 block. As you're coming, you bring your sword back up, you're hitting their block up, and you're going to try to strike again, but then they block again, but then you hit it up one more time, and now you finally get your strike. So if you really describe what something is doing, that's going to be a lot easier for them to remember. It's also going to be a lot more beneficial to them to understand why they were learning it in the first place. Another thing to keep in mind is people learn different ways. So some people can literally learn anything from a book. Good for them, right? Some people have to visually see something happen and then they can replicate it forevermore. Some people need to be actually physically manipulated to understand what the motion is. Now obviously be very careful about this. Obviously consent is always the first priority. So obviously, like I'm not going to do the whole glute situation because don't do that, that's really creepy. But like if I'm holding a guard, I tend to be like maybe off center here, I might be like, all right, well, do you feel this? Like this feels weak. Try moving it more to your center, now hold the sword. So obviously be very careful about what technique you use on what type of person. But be aware that people have different ways of learning. Now one way that you can kind of help with a lot of this is by having mirrors. Now obviously I do have mirrors in my school. I'm not going to show you because then you'll just see the camera. It's not going to be really that helpful. But mirrors are going to be super, super helpful for anyone who's learning a little more independently, and also for people who generally want to see how they are doing. Now that sounds kind of like obvious, but like in the sense that like I can tell someone like, oh, your left hand is bending too much when you cut. Oh, your left hand is bending too much when you cut. But if you look yourself in the mirror, it's like, okay, take a look at cut, now look in the mirror. Like, oh, my left hand is bending when I cut. It's like, I've been telling you that. Like, every instructor knows this. Right? It's like, oh yeah, like, I've been telling you this for like months or years. Just look yourself in the mirror, like, oh yeah, I am doing that. Let me fix it. It's like, but yeah. So mirrors are gonna be a nice way to kind of circumvent a lot of those issues, right? So for example, if someone is more independent, they can kind of, if they understand what they're seeing, they can fix themselves a lot more often, right? As opposed to like, if I'm always telling you the same thing, it's eventually gonna get dull and it's not gonna be sinking in at all. So mirrors are always a good way, but also be aware that people learn different ways. So if you are very dead set on your way you're teaching, try to expand on different sensory input. Another thing to consider is make sure you're using the right tools. So for example, if I'm trying to teach nice left hand use, I don't want you to use a light weapon, right? Because if I'm using a light weapon, it doesn't matter what my left hand is doing because it makes a happy sound. Versus if I'm giving you a heavy weapon, your left hand better not bend too much because you'll definitely feel it. So likewise, if you kind of like draw back to our pushing example, right? If I try to do this on a rocky terrain, it's not going to work, right? Just because like, oh, just push forward, you're going to hit something, you're going to fall over, you might concuss yourself, and it'll be very bad. So make sure you're always in the right situation and you have the right equipment in order to help facilitate that learning, and that you're not using equipment that will facilitate wrong learning. Just like what I talked about with, again, using left hand, light weapons usually are like the biggest harm to new swordsmen. So I usually recommend heavy weapons that can give you a little bit of a feedback in terms of whistling and stuff like that, but heavier weapons are always better. I say always better. They're not always better because there's a tool for every use, but at least for new students, especially with left-hand use, that's something I recommend. That's going on the side tangent. So make sure you are using the right equipment for whatever you're trying to teach. And something especially for older instructors is to encourage question asking. Now, if you're like me, I like to answer questions. I like to go into topics, really break them apart, really understand what's going on, have new applications, have different layers of application for anything. It's always good to have people ask questions. So first of all, that makes you less liable to kind of just keep continuing, perpetuating a half-truthhood, right? So this way, people are asking questions. First of all, it makes you a better instructor because now you understand, first of all, what your students are, what their minds are like, as well as you are better understanding your own material. Now, I understand this is something that's really, really difficult for younger instructors, right? So if you're an assistant instructor, if you just became a master, for example, and you're intending to teach a large amount of people, it is hard to kind of start opening up those questions because you might make it feel like you don't understand your own material. So this is kind of like a double-edged sword. So once you feel like your ego can kind of withstand the hit, as well as your overall understanding can withstand the hit, definitely encourage question asking. Now, obviously, don't let your ego be an issue, but I also understand, if you're brand new to it, it's really daunting to have people oh, why do we do this instead of this? And it's good question. I actually did not think about the answer for that one, so I'll have to think about it later. That's another side thing, actually. If you don't know something, there's no harm in saying, I do not know that just yet. Let me get back to you. So long as you get back to them. Nothing is going to break a student's trust in you more than oh yeah, I'll get back to you, and never get back to it, right? There's going to be something similar in the future point, but make sure you're open with what you know, and if you can kind of on the fly parse something, go ahead, but try to have a nice, thorough understanding of something. And if you don't know something, let them know, but make sure you come back to it. So for example, someone might ask okay, why do we activate our glutes? Why can't we just walk down with a sword like this? It's okay, well, thank you for your question. Well, the main reason is you want to be able to use your bigger muscle groups because first of all, they can withstand more of that hit, right? They can actually push more, they're stronger, they can endure more, versus your smaller muscle groups, which are the ones that people generally use when they're walking down the street. Those are not intended for long-term use or weird kind of pushing motions, especially when you have an extra weight of a sword you're trying to swing with it. So you want to usually use your bigger muscle groups, and you more or less want to use them in symmetry, right? So it's better to use symmetry like here as opposed to like this. Like if I push off this way, I might be pushing off with the glute, but I'm also pushing off with a side muscle. So making sure you're using, again, the big muscle groups, but they're synchronized. They're kind of like symmetry, so there's no like off-putting one way or the other. Just as a nice example of like if someone asks you like, oh, why do we care about glutes? Why do we care about core? It's because it's a big muscle group, and those are going to tire less quickly, give you a lot more power, and also it's just going to be easier for you to synchronize with the rest of your body. And similar to that point is also always consider counter examples, right? So for example, if we're talking about, again, the glute activations, like, okay, do we ever use the side of the foot? Like is there ever a time that you don't want to use your glute? Like, okay, like, well, maybe you might want to use your glute if you don't want to use your glute if you want to have very fine motion control, right? Now, obviously, I was doing something like this, where like, for example, in the beginning of Form 3, we're drawing back here. Like, this is all very small muscle group. This is big muscle group, but the front foot is very small before you shift, right? So yeah, there are going to be some counter examples, but in general, you do want to use your bigger muscle groups. Now, this is a very specific like concept, but there are also other examples that, again, always consider the counter, right? So if I'm teaching, for example, how to block something, right? Like, okay, if I give you center cut, you can give me an 11 or an X block. Cool, right? Well, what if they follow through and come back up, just like what I taught in the beginning of Form 1? It's like, okay, if they do that, you can kind of go off to the side here, right? You can follow them as they give you the upper block, but always be ready to discuss counter examples to whatever concept you're teaching, right? So for more conceptual stuff like muscle activation, there's not usually that many counter examples, but if you're talking about combinations or like how to fight a certain way, be very careful about the way you discuss counter examples. And the last point that I would like to make is always be sure to review later. I mentioned this in my whole like teaching video, but like, so for example, if you teach a concept, make sure you review it in a future class, right? So if I talk about muscle activation, make sure you talk about next class or the class after that. Don't just let it drop off and never discuss it again, because again, that kind of makes the student have like a lack of trust for the instructor, because like, okay, like we spent like a full hour pushing, why aren't we why are we suddenly doing something else, right? So always be sure to go back to that concept in the future time. So yeah, so that's how I usually like to at least think about breaking down a concept and like kind of teaching concept. Again, having a main focus on obviously breaking it down, understanding why and how things are happening, but also understanding the psychology of the student of like, okay, like they first of all want to make sure they first of all feel like they're progressing towards something, to have those confirmable steps. They want to have trust in you, so like they can ask questions and they can know they will get an answer eventually. If you're taught a concept, they know they will eventually use it again. So I feel like this general breakdown is relatively helpful for a large array of teaching styles and teaching schools and stuff like that. But obviously take everything with a grain of salt. I have a very particular way of teaching. I'm very much a more one-on-one kind of instructor, as opposed to like me teaching like a large army of children. To have I have my own way of teaching. I'm very much application-y. Your school may not be, right? So take whatever was helpful for you in this video and expand upon it. So with that, make sure you stay safe, stay humble, and most importantly, keep training. Haidong!